Hi, everyone, and welcome to Wisdom and Wonder, where we explore interesting ideas with curiosity and an open mind. I'm your host, Ann Jen, and today on the podcast we have with us Dr. Brouwer, who teaches chemistry and environmental science here at Redeemer. We also have Alexander Hobbs, a Redeemer student, as my co-host. So welcome to both of you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Dr. Brouwer, could you just give us a little bit of a background of, yourself? How long have you worked here?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been at Redeemer for 15 years, which has totally flown by. I actually was a student here at Redeemer, and I did 3 years at Redeemer, 2 years at Guelph is what I did. I wanted to study chemistry and math, and at the time, way back then, we didn't have a full chemistry program. So I did everything I could here at Redeemer, loved my time here, and then went over to the University of Guelph, and I lived for a while in Vancouver when I did my PhD. And I lived in the UK for a while doing a postdoc, and then worked at Canadian government research labs in Ottawa for a couple of years, and then I came here. So, it's been great. I love being here where I get to do so many things that I love to do. I love to teach. I love to research. I love being part of students' lives. And it's quite an honor to be here to do that.
Okay, well, that sounds amazing. So I guess just sort of the background of why I had you on. So basically, I was talking to some friends, and I feel like that we've been talking about just different issues, because now with the podcast, I feel like I like to talk about current issues. And so we were talking about climate change, and kind of it was interesting to me that some people were very much denying it, and I was like, oh, this is because I think it depends on your group of friends, but for some people I've run into, it's in the Christian world, it's been like, oh, this isn't really happening, or it's not happening the way people are saying that it's happening. So it just felt like, oh, I actually don't know enough about this. Why don't I have someone on who knows more than me, and I can ask them to answer questions about climate change?
Sure.
So that was kind of the impetus for this. So to just get to the first question, what is your understanding of the current state of climate change and its potential impacts?
Yeah, so I hope you don't mind. Maybe I'll give the shortest version of what I can do, what I might do in my teaching.
Okay, sure.
Because
yeah,
instead
absolutely.
of taking a full 50-minute explanation of this, maybe we can do it in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Right. So the first thing we got to think about is what do we mean by the word climate, right? So if we're going to talk about climate change, we got to talk about that, right? So it's actually a word that comes from a Greek word that kind of means inclination. Right. So we think about climate. It's what do we expect the weather to be like in Hamilton, for example, right? What's the climate of Hamilton? So we're thinking about how much sunshine do we get? What's our temperature? How much rain do we get? How much snow do we get? And it's about expectation. It means I don't know what the weather is going to be like in June on my birthday, but I got a pretty good idea what it's going to be. It's the climate. It's going to probably be 25 degrees. Right? And I know that next January, it's probably going to be kind of cold, right? So climate is kind of this long-term expectation of what we expect our environment to be like, right? And the reason this is so important, climate, is that we've built our, human infrastructure around the kind of way we expect our environment to be. So what I mean by that is you don't grow crops in the desert because it's not going to rain, right? We grow crops in southern Ontario because we know we're going to get good rains. We know we're going to get enough sunshine. We built our cities in certain places because of that climate, right? It's kind of we've built all this infrastructure around kind of what we expect, with the types of infrastructure we've built to deal with the kind of climates that we have. So there's that. Climate is kind of expectation. And maybe another thing to talk about is we sometimes use the word global warming and climate change somewhat interchangeably. So one way to think about that is global warming is about this effect that we're seeing where the average global temperature is increasing, or average temperatures in different locations is increasing. And then climate change is, okay, what does a rising temperature, how does that work itself out in all these kind of planetary scale systems? So what does an elevated temperature mean for precipitation patterns, and so on and so forth, right? So climate change is they're very connected, but climate change is kind of wider because it covers all the different aspects of climate. So we'll sometimes use those words interchangeably, but that's a good thing. All right, so I think the evidence for a warming planet is pretty overwhelming, right? So we're really seeing it this winter. And there's a reason we're seeing it this winter, which maybe we can come back to. But scientists have been monitoring this for a long period of time. And I don't just mean like taking thermometer readings and like calculating some sort of average temperature over the globe. I mean, they're looking at sea ice levels, and they're looking at migration patterns, and they're looking at when do the trees bloom over in different years, and why are some species moving northward and up mountains? And there's just all these different kind of observations that are all consistent with this idea of a warming world. And we can even look back in time. We have sort of ways to sort of make estimates of what things would have been like in the past, tree ring sizes and, isotopes trapped in ice layers. And there's all sorts of ways we've kind of looked in the past to sort of get proxies of what the climate used to be. So it's pretty clear that we live in a warming planet. And I think what the challenge comes into is like, why? Like, what might be causing this? If this is happening, is it just some sort of natural cycle that the Earth has? Is it some sort of natural process? Sometimes the Earth warms, sometimes it cools down, and we just happen to be in an upswing, and then later we'll get into a downswing again. And certainly when we look in the past of geological history, it looks like there's been fluctuations. But I think what's different now is, yes, there's all sorts of natural Earth systems that might give rise to changing climates, but the rate at which we're changing is like way faster than kind of like geological timescale. So there's something unique about this. But it actually turns out the answer is pretty obvious. So, and what I mean by obvious is that we have known So it's the fact that we have an atmosphere that has gases, and we won't get into the chemistry of it all. But we've known this for a really long time. We know how this works. And about 150 years ago, we figured out which molecules are the important ones for sort of trapping sort of heat at the surface of the Earth's temperature. And this is what we kind of call today like the greenhouse effect, right? And I'm going to refer to it as the natural greenhouse effect because I think it's a part of God's it's part of God's creation. Like without it, we're a frozen ice planet, right? So it is essential that our atmosphere has this greenhouse effect because it's what keeps our Earth's average temperature on 15 degrees. It means the water is mostly liquid, life can happen, and so on and so forth. All right, but about 120 years ago, there's a scientist who thought, there's one of these gases in particular that's increasing. And he did a bit of a rough calculation, and he says, if this one gas in the atmosphere is increasing, it's going to enhance the natural greenhouse effect. Okay? And it turns out that gas is this thing called carbon dioxide. So why did he think this was increasing? Well, in the years around 1750, we discovered that we can dig out coal from the ground. And this was awesome because coal can be burned to power machines. Machines have kicked off the Industrial Revolution. And ever since then, we have been like, sweet. We've got all this stuff we can dig out of the ground that we can use as fuel to power machines, to power cars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It's an immense gift, these fuels that we can dig out of the earth. But whenever we burn a fuel, we always, there's no way around it, make carbon dioxide. And it's a gas, so it just vents into the atmosphere. So humanity's been doing this, since the Industrial Revolution. We're taking these fuels out of the Earth's crust and we're burning them for the purposes of human society, now driving, flying, heating our homes, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So, and we know that carbon dioxide, what it does. We know how it works. We know the physics of how infrared radiation, it traps heat and so on and so forth. So the message I want to talk about is this thing that is driving global warming and climate change is simply a enhancement of a natural effect. Okay, it's always been there. It's always played a role, but now humans on such a massive scale have added so much of it that's now beginning to have an effect. Okay, and none of this, I don't think any of this is controversial. The scientific evidence for this process is well known. In my teaching, I pull out an article from the New York Times from 1956 where they're talking about this, that as we burn more fuel, the greenhouse effect is going to increase. All right, so this is all well known. And then it gets a little tricky if you want to sort of like, okay, what are the impacts of this? Now you have to start predicting the future, right? And that's harder to do, right? So climate scientists will make models of how the Earth system work, and they'll say, okay, if we continue in this way, what's it gonna do, right? So we're gonna make projections, and we're gonna try to predict the future with our models, which are always kind of incomplete, obviously. They're simplifications of the real thing. That's what a model is. But the thing is, most of these models, they've got lots of variation, but most of these models show that, that as temperatures will rise, they'll have these climate effects, and most of these things are going to be really challenging. And as I said earlier, what I think about is we've built our civilization on assumptions, and those assumptions are changing. So we built these massive cities next to oceans, okay? One of the effects of climate change will be melting ice and expansion of water, and ocean levels will rise. Not like it's not going to be some apocalyptic flooding of these, everything's going to go underwater, but you always have to plan your infrastructure for worst case scenarios, right? So ocean level goes up 2 feet, okay, no big deal. But it's when the storm comes and your storm surge is bigger than what you were planning for, then you'll have, a flooded city, So the concern is, as time goes on and as these impacts happen, our infrastructure, which is incredibly expensive and has been built up over centuries, on a certain assumption of a climate, will no longer be, it'll be challenging to adapt to this. Similar to agriculture, right? We put our agriculture in places where we assume a certain thing about the climate, but what if that climate begins to change? It gets really, really challenging. So I often want to sort of like talk people like the Earth's not burning up and we're all going to go up. That's kind of somehow we find it in culture, that climate change, the Earth is burning. Mm-hmm. That's not what it is. It's a slow, steady process of the climate getting further and further away from the kind of assumptions we've used to make. And it's going to be really hard. It's potentially going to be really hard to deal with. There's going to be there might be famines. There might be natural disasters that are worse than they used to be. There's going to be refugees. There's going to be people who can't live where they used to live. And it's going to be difficult. That's my concern, is that we're moving into a place where it just gets harder to live in certain places. I suspect for us in Canada, we're going to be mostly fine. But it's kind of the people who are in other parts of the world, probably the most vulnerable, we're going to start feeling this. So that's kind of how I think about it. Like it's a well understood process. It's a natural process that we're enhancing through this massive use of fossil fuels that have enabled us to do so many of the things we take for granted and are a great blessing in our lives. But we have to figure out how to deal with this.
Okay. Wow. Okay. That was great and very informative. I appreciate that. Yeah, because I was like looking into, this was just, I don't know why this came up, but anyways, it came up about Pew Research Group did this study. I think it was in 2022, and this is obviously in the States, so it is different. Mm-hmm. We are not exactly like them, but they said that they did a study across like religions, mm-hmm. of like what groups of people in even a religious context, like they did Catholics and Muslims. Anyways, it was like, and then they like further divided Christianity into like they kind of like did it even further. So they think they started with religions and then they went even further into like denominational differences. And so one of the things that I noticed and they kind of acknowledged in the study was that the lowest group of people to believe in human, and specifically the question was asking whether or not they thought climate change was a result of human action or not. So like everyone was like, yeah, we can agree that this warming, but back to your point, people are like, it's just a natural cycle. It's not related to the fact that we are like driving more and everyone has 2 cars as opposed to like even, 100 years ago where like maybe a family had 1. Right now people can like, your kid has a car, that's 3 cars. Like you just, we think about that kind of idea. So basically they didn't believe that it was a human activity that was causing like the rise of carbon in the atmosphere and things like that. And I was just curious if that's something that like you've had to address here or like in general, like being a Christian scientist, like how does that play into, your experience?
Yeah, great question. This gets really interesting. Maybe I can just back up for one moment.
Sure.
Because I think it's relevant. But, right, the fact, like, this is a wickedly complex problem, climate change. And I think what I've just described, it's so complex because so much of our quality of life, abundance of life that we enjoy is actually connected to our use of energy from fossil fuels. So this makes this problem so difficult because we have to reimagine somehow how to do this incredibly wealthy, advanced society we have. We have to figure out another, potentially, climate change. If we're going to address it, we have to stop using fossil fuels. And that has been the source of such increased standard of living since the Industrial Revolution, right? So that's at its heart, it's a question of how the heck are we going to do that, right? And that's what makes it so challenging. So are we going to come up with some incredible new technology that's going to, not use fossil fuels, but still have all this access to energy? And that's why we're people want to, that's wind power, solar power, hydrogen power. Like that's why there's this huge push to get that. So right there, I think it's at the heart of kind of Western civilization is we have gained so much benefit from the use of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. And now we have to figure out, if this is true, we have to figure out another pathway. And it is really hard. It's not some silver bullet we can snap and have. So then you're sort of faced with, do we decrease our standard of living, right? Or do we, so all sorts of questions. So then back to the question of Christians, right? So maybe that's a factor. Like maybe that's we've sort of bought, and I don't think this is the major factor, but maybe we're just so steeped in North American culture that we cannot imagine giving up our standards of living. So I don't know if that necessarily applies. It probably applies to everybody. So I think I can think of a couple things that why I think maybe this kind of evangelical stream of Christianity has a hard time with this. So maybe I'll name a couple things. And I'll maybe get into some of the details. I think, one, politics, especially in America, has been so polarized, and climate change has ended up on the so-called left-wing Democrat side. Mm-hmm. Right. And if you happen to be Republican, you kind of have to pick a team. You got to pick a side. Maybe that's oversimplifying it. And most evangelical Christians in the U.S. are Republicans, tend to be. Not everyone, but so broad strokes. So I lament this fact that these issues become partisan and polarized. So climate change has sadly become kind of polarized and partisan. So to be right wing, it's your camp. You sort of have to also believe this. Broad strokes. We'll get into that. We can get into that a little bit more detail. I think there's also this sense of evangelicals have a really complicated relationship to science, right? Think of like questions around origins and evolution and creation, right? There's kind of this inherent skepticism about the claims of science. So if science is telling us that evolution happened, why should we listen to you about climate change, right? So there's kind of this immediate sort of, I don't buy it. Right. Broad strokes again. So a complicated relationship with science, polarization of politics. And then there's this strange sort of, I don't think we have this, at least not in kind of Redeemer's sort of founding vision, but in evangelicals, you kind of find there's a bit of a dualism. And what I mean by that is the most important things often in an evangelical world are spiritual things. And they kind of downplay the sort of physical material world in a way. Right? So I don't know, you're sort of like, this is kind of in the water of evangelicalism, that it's about saving souls and going to heaven, which are all true and good things. But I feel that sometimes that tradition gives just a narrow view of the gospel, right? And they sort of like don't perhaps see that maybe God wants to redeem his whole creation and that it's God's creation. So like he likes it, he made it. As his image bearers, perhaps we should care for it. You know what I mean? And that sort of dualism kind of informs a lot of things. And I don't know, we can talk a bit more about that, but I think at Redeemer, like, we're trying to avoid that, right? And the way we approach the world, this is God's world. It is fallen and it is broken, but it's good. Like, God's created world is good. It is God's. He sustains it. He upholds it. And he wants to see the whole cosmos, all of his creation, be restored and redeemed. And God's people should be engaged in this, not just kind of like, I am a soul that's trying to escape this physical world so I can go off in heaven, right?
It's Platonism.
Yeah.
It's
I was
kind of
thinking, I was thinking that
it's
too.
kind of Platonist ideas are they've wiggled themselves into evangelicalism. And I think what we try to do at Redeemer, I think, is to try to avoid that and have this comprehensive view of the gospel. That yes, it's about people's personal relationship with God, but it goes way beyond. The scope is so much bigger. So it gives us this platform to sort of take these kind of questions of environmentalism much more seriously than I think a lot. If you have a bit of a Platonistic kind of viewpoint, take a bit more seriously. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that I think are some of the like why that survey would have picked out. So I'm happy to talk about those in a bit more detail.
Do you have any questions before I jump in? I have
Sure.
I'll let you have some questions.
As you talk, I get more and more questions. But the one thing I'm wondering, I think the climate change issue has come to the forefront more recently. So how was it talked about, especially in like Christian circles, when you were in university, and how has that changed?
Okay. Oh, good question. So yeah, I think the rise of this issue of climate change is, I think year by year the urgency just gets a bit more. So yeah, when I was a student, I don't think the urgency was there. So it wasn't even broader culturally, it wasn't really there. But what I would say is, when I was a student here at Redeemer, and also knowing kind of the network of Christian colleges, there has always been probably a minority, the folks who end up teaching science at Christian universities. So many of those people have developed a really robust view of God's creation, the importance to care, why this matters. So kind of this sort of stewardship ethos that is needed and flows out of the biblical story, I think, of what it means to be an image bearer of God. Like I am very fortunate that was always with me, right? In my experience at Redeemer and meeting other Christians who were taking this stuff very seriously. I mean, I didn't grow up in kind of evangelical circles, more kind of Reformed, where this kind of view was always there. Most of it was from my father, who was a professor at Redeemer before me. So yeah, climate change itself was not really on the radar screen when I was a student. It's raised an urgency, but there was always this foundation that I was blessed to experience of, we need to take God's creation seriously. We need to take the human impact on God's creation very seriously. Perhaps we need to rethink how we live our lives, even to be able to care for God's creation and be a witness to the world that this is God's creation and we're supposed to care for it.
I'm curious about when you talked about, Dr. Hill was a speaker that came for the Wolterstorff Center a couple of years back, and he had this thing that he said, because he works, it's an unrelated issue in some ways, but he works in the inner city with youth, and started a school that was like that's very academically rigorous, but with like underprivileged families. And he was like, his like whole quote, like the thing that he said that I thought was so interesting, and it kind of like ties in with what you said, was about like the imagination. Like he's like, at one point someone imagined that slavery would not be here, and then they decided that they were going to work towards that end. And he was like, at that time, the whole industry, everything was related to slavery. It was so pivotal to like the world in that time period. But, you know, there was a time where someone just was like, I imagine a different world. And he's like, and I just thought, like, when you said that reimagining, I was like, oh, that kind of like, if we think about that as a parallel of like, there was a time when like people imagined, you know, because that's kind of an idea that is maybe similar in some ways.
Yeah, and sadly, it's always kind of a minority of people who I think have latched onto this idea. I feel kind of sad that it's this kind of posture of care and stewardship has not fully permeated sort of North American Christianity, which is a bit sad.
It is a bit sad.
'Cause I think it's there.
Yeah.
And I think we have such great resources. And I think our tradition here at Redeemer, I think it has wonderful resources for equipping people to do that. And we try to do that in our teaching, right? We're not alarmists. We're not running an agenda. We just think like, this is God's good creation, and all the science seems to be pointing on stress on it.
I'm just this person.
It's a classic question.
Yeah, like everyone just like, it's kind of like, you don't want to just like hand wring and be like, oh, this is terrible, but you're also like, I don't like know what I'm supposed to be doing to like help this or change it or.
So yeah, this one's really tricky because it's like, I'm a single person, and this issue it's a slow, steady, planetary issue that may not manifest itself in significant ways until I'm long dead. You know what I mean? Like we're thinking in like, it's difficult for humans to think, you know, in 100-year timescales.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So absolutely, it feels kind of paralyzing. So here's a couple of things to think about. Like maybe sometimes we're not necessarily called to like effectiveness, but faithfulness, right?
Okay.
So that's one way to think about it. Like,
Right.
will my actions save the world? It's not my job to save the world, right? My job is to live faithfully. And as I think about what it means to live faithfully in this creation that God has made, maybe it's changing how I get around. Maybe it's changing the food I eat, right? Maybe it's changing the kind of house I live. You know, like there's these questions. Will it change, you know, it's a classic question. Well, can one person, all those things if enough people do it, it will, right? Mm-hmm. So then you're into this question, and this is where things get really complicated, right? To really solve this problem, and this is why it's so hard, we need actually like governmental solutions, but not just by governments of nations, because Canada, you hear the same rhetoric, right? What does it matter if Canada does anything on this? Because we're only like 1% of the population. So why bother? Why like slow down our economic prosperity when we're not going to make such a difference, right? So that you hear that rhetoric sometimes. It's not worth it, right? so then the problem sticks with us, right? This kind of inaction. And then you're up to like, global scale treaties, and how complicated is that, right? To sort of work out, that we can all agree from, China and India and Russia and America, all these major economic powerhouses are all going to say, yeah, let's take the pedal off of economic development. It's wickedly complex. But something like that probably has to happen, but it might be unlikely that it will.
Yeah.
So then the other thing is, maybe it gets solved with like just sheer economics of things. So for example, like if you think about diet, you can sort of track, that a plant-based diet is kind of better for the environment than eating lots of meat. And I'm not a vegetarian. I enjoy meat, but but what's going to probably happen is that you and I might not be able to afford very much meat. Like it might just take care of itself. Right. So, but yeah, we've said like, well, let's embrace that. Like there's amazing vegetarian food. It's a fun challenge. My wife and I both love to cook, and let's just go for it. Like let's not be all sort of pessimistic about all this. Like, but let's try to find flourishing in God's gifts of plants,
right?
Because they're amazing,
right? Yeah.
So, but it's a really complex. Like, yeah, what does one little thing do? My little actions. If I recycle or bike to work or walk to the store, but that just leads to like apathy, though.
Yeah.
So then, if you think, how is God faithfully calling me to live in this world? Maybe that reframes it and helps you imagine something different, but you live it out with enthusiasm and positivity and hopefulness, and maybe that catches on.
Okay, and I feel like as you talk, I just have like do you have any more questions? Because I have another one, but I'm sorry if I'm like.
I was just going to add that like your point about slavery is like I think very relevant to this because, we think about Christians during the time when slavery was a very big thing. Like, why should we care if what they did made a difference? We should care that they were actually following God's commands and his creation of humanity. And so, like, if we were in that time, why would it matter if what we did made a difference in freeing slaves? It would matter more that we were being faithful to God and treating fellow humans like humans, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that
but it still took very inspirational leaders, right? Like,
and that's hopeful as well, right? Because we can see that.
And there are a few people like that who are Christians who are very inspiring and are doing their best to sort of inspire people. So one person I think of is like Catherine Hayo. I'm not sure if you know her name. She's got a gift from God to communicate in a winsome, non-threatening, hopeful kind of way, and she's for significant numbers of people, she's flipped the switch. Right. She still gets like hate mail, but but she has a gift, and I don't know how that's going to play out, but I hope it will.
I love Wendell Berry because he's quite a strong advocate for environmentalism. He's like, anyways, I've read a bunch of his essays and a lot of his just novels, and I just like him as an author on multiple levels. But he advocates a lot for like a local economy. He says that part of the reason why where we are is that we are so. Because I was talking about this with a friend, dear friend, and she was saying like it's so hard to buy things because everything comes from China, and you can't like even if you buy something here, it's like the packaging says made in Canada, but like all the products were from another country that's like you're supporting like sweatshops and all this stuff. So you're just like I don't know how to like be a good consumer, and you're like I just feel like I'm implicit like, and I've been saying this to with my investments. There's a it's called Kindred Credit Union, and our church actually uses it because they try to be like really ethical with their investments, and right, like not supporting weapons because it's also it's through, I think, like a brethren in Christ, so they believe in pacifism.
Yeah.
So like none of their investments, as far as they can tell, like go back to a certain level to be like they're not in guns and weapons, and they're in green, and obviously the return on your investment is less because it's not like the Fortune 500, which are going to make a bunch more money, and people are like, oh, it's hard to even save up for my retirement. I'm going to like take a hit on what I'm going to make on my investment. So it just feels like this issue is so interwoven into society that you almost are like, okay, how can I'm just care about this, because it feels like everything is interconnected in some crazy level where you're like, I can care about like one thing, but I also just need to go home and get my kids from school and make dinner, right? Like you're just
totally.
It's just like, I think that's what people struggle with. At least I have found that even for myself. I'm just trying to be faithful.
Yep. I think that's, I don't think I have an answer to that because it is so complex. Yeah, I'm in the same boat, right? So yeah, my wife and I, how do we do our investments? We try our best, right? Food, we try our best. Yeah, but it might also mean like, these on the political level, we need, maybe this becomes part of our criteria for voting. But yeah, it's so complicated. I don't think there's not a silver bullet, and I think this one is so complicated. It might even be more complicated than something like slavery.
Yeah.
In a way, I mean, I think it's less because it doesn't involve humans directly.
Yeah.
It's from a moral standpoint, it's
more ambiguous.
It's a little bit more ambiguous, but the economic, societal interconnections of it all makes it so complicated. But, like, I don't know. I like to completely say it's not happening.
Yeah.
Is also like sticking your head in the sand or maybe it's not happening and I will oppose any efforts to deal with it.
Yeah.
Oof. And if those people happen to be Christians, you're just like, ugh. Right?
Yeah, that is it is a little demoralizing.
Yeah.
I think that's always the problem with like being a part of a group. You're like, I like struggle with that too sometimes. I'm like, I'm part of this Christian group, but not really those people over there. I'm like, the challenge of like unity when there's just really often just disagreement. And I think sometimes people are just ignorant to potentially too of not really knowing or, listening to the wrong people, right? Like I feel like if, there's people that you trust are saying all of these things and your family members, or like you grow up in a family that's like, this isn't happening. Like you're just going to accept that. And I think, you're going to have to, but I think this is why Redeemer's working is really, I'm like so grateful for your work, because I think that is a helpful, like giving illumination to something like this in a Christian centered way.
And you use the word trust there. I think at a certain point, we do not have time to make all the decisions, right? For life, like what to buy, like understand climate science, right? Even me, I'm not a climate scientist, so I have to put some sort of trust in people's claims that they're making, right? And and people talk about a little bit on this kind of like why sometimes Christians are evangelicals tend to be kind of skeptical of this. And there's a bit of, people talk about the language of like tribalism, right? So they kind of belong to a tribe. They're not hearing any other, and we live in a time where there's lots of echo chamber, right? With the way social media and the news work, you end up hearing what the algorithm thinks you want to hear. And it's just kind of everything reinforces. And we all have to make decisions about who we're going to trust. And so I think on this issue, we have to sort of, I feel a burden for it that my students at Redeemer, I can build a sense of trust. And I'm not going to come in with guns a-blazing for people who might be a little bit skeptical on this, but I want to build a sense of trust so they'll be open to hear what I want to hear, right? And maybe shift their thinking a little bit. And I've experienced that with students here. They start off going, kind of looking at me a little funny, but we sort of build some trust, and they're like, okay, yeah, this might be an issue I need to think about. Like I've had that moment with students, and and I hope that they trust me.
Yeah.
And I hope we can all find some voices we can trust. So.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any? I feel like do you have any other questions before I hop into another question?
I think, yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess to maybe my final question, I was like, we have 5 more minutes. I can scoot one more in. Like, just so that kind of getting back to the question of like faithfulness. Like what, I guess if you could give someone advice or like what maybe some like direction in terms of what to read, people that are like, you mentioned Catherine, what's her last name?
Hey-ho.
Okay. Yeah. If there's like, just some follow-up, like people do want to investigate this more, maybe there's some resources.
Yeah. So definitely, I think Catherine Hayhoe is a very effective communicator. So you'll find she's all over. Yeah, she's got her way of communicating this. Lots of YouTube videos. She's got 2 books out, I think. Very like writing to Christians, writing to evangelicals. She's very good, and she's a person worthy of trust, in my opinion. I've met her. But I think, let me just think of what else I would recommend. So that's what I would recommend on the climate change front. There's also like, if someone is like, okay, I need to sort of like dive into sort of like, I want to understand a little bit more of the science on this. Like where'd you go? Because you can find anything you want on the internet, of course.
Yeah.
So there's actually a website called Skeptical Science.
Okay.
Which is kind of they're like skeptical of the skeptics. So they're actually kind of defending climate change. They do a very good job of like little bite-sized pieces, sort of, walking through kind of why these kind of skeptical arguments don't hold up and why kind of science. So if people want to sort of, that's a good place if they're sort of interested in the scientific aspect of things. I would recommend that. And then, I'm just trying to think of some authors that I would think about. So there's an organization in Canada called Arasha.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, which is a Christian conservation organization that has been, inspired by a deep conviction that this is God's creation. We're to care for it. It kind of comes out of those kind of people I was describing. The Christian professors that I described. Right. It's kind of this move. It's kind of embodied this movement. So they're an international organization all over the world. Of evangelical Christians, whatever that word means these days now, but who have been classified as evangelical Christians. And they do amazing work. And they're based in Vancouver. There's a group based here in Hamilton. And I would say that they've got great resources on their website. They're great people to meet, volunteer with, go to events. But I know these people really well too. They're kind of like, they've got 2 mission areas, 2 areas of focus. It's actually the church to sort of, try to encourage pastors to maybe have 1 sermon a year on questions of Christian stewardship. And so, and churches and so they're kind of trying to sort of resource the church for that. And then the other area is to just be a faithful environmental presence, like in the environmental community. So what does a Christian organization do? How do they do it differently, right? Where does their hope come from? Because there's a lot of despair out there too, right? So how do they bring hope to the broader environmental community through the work that they do? So they're some of my favorite people.
Okay.
So their website would have lots of maybe sermons and readings that they have. There's a British theologian, John Stott, who's kind of like big cheerleader of Arasha. So he's written on this. Harris, what's his first name? He's the founder of it. He has a couple books about the Arasha story. They're just also good. Yeah, this good sort of picture of what a holistic, comprehensive gospel attitude to both personal salvation and God's world look like.
Oh wow, that sounds. Yeah, I have heard of them, and I've heard like people who work there have only had great things to say. So that's good to hear. I think the other thing that I was just thinking about what you were saying is like being open to being wrong, and having like, I think there's a level of, and you do learn this in philosophy, because sometimes you come in and you have a really think your argument's so great, and then you test it and you're like, actually that was a terrible argument, I'm wrong. But I think there's a level of just being like, I think we all have to have like that, not completely with everything, but I think there's a level of just being open to hearing the other side, hearing the other perspective, and then not to challenge the other perspective, but being like, okay, why do you think this? And because I think back to the tribalism that you were mentioning at the beginning, like if there's no talking between these groups,
Absolutely.
You're not going to convince someone who's a climate change denier or someone that's like is actively working. How are you going to win them over to your side? Maybe you won't, but like you're definitely not if you're not going to talk to them. And there's a level of like they're like there's such a strong of like, well, they believe this, so they're out. We can't even talk to them.
And there may even be good motivations to have a sense of skepticism also, right? Like I want to maybe defend a skeptic in a sense, because at the same time all of this is happening, right? There may be people who are maybe trying to exploit the climate change issue and bring in other things that are undesirable. Like there might be, and that doesn't mean you deny that it's happening, but you sort of, have a little bit of a skepticism of maybe some of these claims, like, is the world going to burn up? Like this kind of over claim of something. No, it's urgent and it's serious, but humanity's not going to be wiped out, right? That sometimes we get that, and maybe people have this culture of fear, so that I don't know, like maybe this is overstating it, so we can use climate change to sort of bring in our socialist agenda, or sometimes like I think that's something that is kind of out there, but that doesn't mean you throw the whole issue away.
Right.
You push back on that, and so I think some motivations for people to be a little skeptical of these claims, it's you gotta hear them out, for sure, and figure out if they're justified or not, and the world's a complicated place, and you've got competing interests, like still feed people, still like, you know what I mean, like it's really complicated.
Right. Well, on the note of complication, thank you so much, Dr. Brouwer, and thank you, Alex, for joining us today. I'm your host, Ann Jan, and join us next time on Wisdom and Wonder as we explore more fascinating ideas with curiosity and an open mind. Thanks so much.